Today, we have a crazy revenge story on a lazy team member who took OP's work. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, getting back at my stepmom for sabotaging me. My stepmom and I do not get along. She has a way of twisting my words and misinterpreting things. I cannot make a joke or say a word in front of her without getting accused of trespassing or being insulting. Almost like she's always trying to portray herself as a saint and make me look bad. I once joked about how a guy in my class mispronounced a particular word and imitated him, which everyone found hilarious, till my stepmom came into the room and began asking questions about the person I was imitating. I told her I don't know much about him. He was just a newly transferred student who was from India, and somehow the conversation went from me making a joke to being an inconsiderate person who mocks a person's pronunciations without understanding how hard it must be for him to be adjusting to his new environment, and somehow I became the villain. Before that, I commented on how nice it would be if she got highlights, because I overheard her telling my dad she wanted to do something different with her hair, and she interpreted it as me telling her to dye her hair totally since she was getting old. I never even said anything relating to that. There have been other scenarios that made our conversations awkward. This was something she did regularly. I would casually bring up a random topic and talk about it, and amid discussion, she changes the narrative in a loving, polite way, of course, and always ending each statement with, "I just don't want you making such a mistake outside." What upsets me most times is how my dad pretends not to notice these things because he doesn't want to pick sides. My stepmom is quite crafty in her words and knows how to get under my skin, but she never does that with my siblings, and I think this is because she knows they're younger and easier to manipulate. Like Betty, my 10 years old sister, sees no problem with owning her own iPad and has been bringing this up at home, which I have been very much against because I know my younger sister would become too fixated on it, as she usually does with all electronic devices. The television, my phone, our dad's computer. She gets distracted too easily, and this would affect her schoolwork tremendously. And I tried to explain this to my stepmom when she sought out my advice on what to get my younger sister as a gift for her upcoming birthday, but guess who ignored all my advice and still went ahead to get an iPad for my 10 years old sister? My sister loved it. Definitely gained my stepmom some points with my sister, and who could blame her? She had been given something she desperately wanted but could not have by my stepmom. She adored her and cherished the gift even more, and I knew it was going to be a problem in the future, but if I said anything, I automatically became the bad sister who didn't want her sister to be happy, or the jealous one who didn't get an iPad for her birthday, so I said nothing. 2 months later, my dad ended up seizing the tablet from my sister because she was too fixated on it alone, like I knew she would. The same thing happened with my younger brother, 14, who kept demanding it was time he learned how to drive. My dad was against this. He told my brother he could do whatever he wanted when he was out of high school, but he needed him focused on his studies. I knew my brother wasn't going to take no for an answer, and I get that he was being rebellious, but my stepmom knew better than to give her car to my teenage younger brother and his friends because one of his friends claimed to be a professional driver at 15. They bashed her car, and my dad refused to pay for any damage that was done to the car because she was partially responsible for what happened. That was the first time I saw my dad get mad at my stepmom because it could have been worse, and she knew that too. But she was just trying to buy my siblings love by giving in to any of their requests. To some extent, I understood she was just trying to make things work with us as a family, but she wasn't being genuine in her actions. Manipulating and exerting herself in every conversation I brought up was not the way to go about it. When things started to get even weirder than normal was when I decided that I was going to run for student government president. I came home as usual and told my dad I was going to run for student government president. My dad brought it up over dinner, and my stepmom got to find out about it. She became all giddy and excited, saying she was going to help, since this was her area of specialization and she knew all tactics I could use to become one. She asked me who my opponents were and what they were like, and pointed out some things I should focus on, and for a moment there, I thought maybe there's a chance for stepmom and I to work together as a team and bury the hatchet once and for all. So I said yes to her helping me out. She asked about my social status at school, about clubs I was at. She asked why I was running and then told me to write a list of reasons why I was running and how I could make better changes in the school. This was going to determine my level of seriousness over whatever I was aiming for and would let her know if I had a chance at running or should just quit early. I liked that version of my stepmom, the one who wasn't being annoying, and this was the first time I was seeing her this way. I wanted her to be honest and blunt, and she was being just that. I made the list and gave it to her the next day. She read the list and her first reaction was bursting into laughter. I had no idea what was funny because I knew nothing I wrote on my list was funny, but my stepmom saw it differently. She said what I wrote was nothing but a joke, and if I wanted to be taken seriously, I had to do better than that. Normally, I wasn't the patient type. I knew what mockery looked like, and it felt like I was being mocked, but against my better judgment, I took her words as a challenge and decided to write another list, this time to please my stepmom, so I put in a lot of effort into writing my heart out. I showed it to a couple of friends at school the next day, and they thought it was brilliant, and these girls do not hold back. So when I gave my stepmom and all she could do was tear up the sheet of paper and tell me there was no way in hell I was going to become student government president with that level of ambition, I was devastated. I cried because I thought I wasn't fit to run for such a position if my list was that bad. A part of me that learned nothing decided to keep pushing, and I kept saying to myself, maybe she was right. If I couldn't handle the hard truth, I might as well quit now. So I went ahead to make a third list. This time a week had passed and my opposing parties were already announcing themselves while I was conflicted on what to do. I wrote another list and showed it to my homeroom teacher, who felt it was brilliant and corrected and instructed me on what I could do to make my list even better. This was when it started to dawn on me that maybe my stepmom was just doing what she did best while I was unaware. She was trying to dismiss all my efforts as nothing to wear me out and make me feel like I was unfit to run for such a position. I decided to test my theory by giving her the next list to check, and she still felt it wasn't good enough and that I should just not even bother running for the student government president because I wasn't fit for such a position, in her words. I knew she didn't have my best interest at heart and decided that I was done with such a negative person, so I stopped sharing any information about my race for student government president with my stepmom and met my homeroom teacher for help with my campaign speech, posters, and slogans. I spent a lot of time at school because I was busy and I dreaded the idea of going home to see my annoying stepmom and her hypocritical smile asking me about how my day was like she was interested in anything I had to say. A week before voting, my stepmom suddenly stopped by my school to pick me up since she was on her way back from work and my dad told her I was still in school. I'm guessing she saw a poster of me running for the student government president. She said nothing at first, but I knew she was surprised to see that I was still running, especially since I stopped talking about it at home. On the ride home, she gave me a speech about how she had no idea I was still in the race for student president and how hurt she felt that I said nothing. I had nothing to say to her, so I said nothing, and suddenly she parked by the side of the road and angrily went off at me about how I was making things difficult for her and how she was trying her best to be a good stepmom, but she has no idea why I act like such a brat and make things unnecessarily difficult for her. It was a funny speech, to be honest, because if I wanted to make things difficult for her, like she claimed I was doing, I could do that by telling my dad about how she made me feel irrelevant enough to almost quit running for the student president, but I held back because I was busy with my campaign and the kids love her. I didn't want to be responsible for breaking my dad's marriage, so I've been staying quiet. I didn't give her the reaction or response she was looking for. I remained quiet even after she finished her speech, and when she saw she wasn't going to get any response from me, we drove in silence. 2 days later, I got to school to find out someone had sent a video of me mimicking the Indian guy at school to the class group, and everyone in my class saw the video. This did not earn me any points because my video came off as a lot of things to people and not in a good way. This cost me the election, despite how many times I tried to explain to everyone that we were playing a game at home that night and I was just spicing things up. No one listened to me. I did not become the student government president. I had to apologize to the class and the new student over and over for my rude behavior, which I never knew could cause so much chaos, and out of the blue, it dawned on me that the video must have been sent to my competition by a family member since we were the only ones together, and if I remember correctly, the only person who recorded anything was my younger brother. I knew my younger brother would never do anything to sabotage me. I knew that much, but still went ahead to confront him on why he would send a video like that to one of my opponents, and he immediately denied having anything to do with the video. The only person he gave was my stepmom, who claimed she needed it for future purposes. I knew without a doubt she was responsible. She was the only other person who knew I was still running for president. I had to confirm if she was indeed responsible, so I went to ask my opposing mate who posted the video how she got her hands on it, and of course, it was sent to her anonymously. As soon as I saw the number that sent it to her, I knew without any doubt that it was my stepmom. She used one of her workers' phones, who I was familiar with, because I once saw her at the salon my stepmom owned. The first time my dad wanted to introduce her to us, he parked by the side of the salon and went to meet my stepmom. I saw the lady leaving the salon before my stepmom closed up and came to join us in the car, so there was no doubt she was the one. I told my dad my stepmom sabotaged me and explained how she got the video from my brother and used one of her workers' phones to send the video to a competitor who posted the video, and how this costed me the position I desperately wanted. And this led to a full-blown argument between my dad and my stepmom. She denied it at first, but later admitted she did it out of jealousy because I chose my homeroom teacher to help with my campaign over her. To cut the long story short, my dad asked her to apologize, and that was it. But I wasn't satisfied with her apology after what she did. So I reported her salon for being unsanitary online, and a week later, I was told by my dad that my stepmom was asked to make some renovations. Something about a drainage pipe that water passed being compromised, and that was a lot of money she did not have right now, so she was closing the shop till she got it fixed. I had no idea if people had also filed reports against her to stop, or if it was just pure luck and my report got to the appropriate authorities who took action against her shop, but to see her almost losing something like I did was worth it. It took a couple of months to get her store renovated, which made her lose some clients, and that was more than enough for me. Our next story is, I thoroughly embarrassed my coworker. A long time ago, I was 26 and working as a live-in chef for a wealthy entrepreneur. The family employed a housekeeper a year after I started working with them. Her name is Lucy, a stunning 25-year-old woman who's very ambitious, except that her only ambition is to marry rich and hobnob with the wealthy women and wives of wealthy men that she admires. When she first started working with the family, I knew she was out of my league, even though we both worked nearly the same job, and I earned more money than she did. I just knew that there was no way someone like her would be interested in me. Lucy was very pretty, and I was a handsome man in my days too, but I just didn't think I could live up to our standards. We quickly became friends right after she resumed working in the house, and she would tell me about her lofty dreams of marrying our boss or any of his other wealthy friends. Bear in mind that at this time, our boss's wife was very much alive, albeit battling a chronic illness. I would chide her for talking about marrying the man when his wife was still very much alive, and she would roll her eyes at me and then tell me about all the famous people who had the same disease she had and died eventually. Well, the lady of the house did in fact die. Our boss was sad, but everyone knew the day was coming and I had prepared for it. Shortly after her death, I noticed a change in the housekeeper, Lucy's dressing style. She had always been a stylish, fashionable girl, but she became even more fashionable after the mourning period. All her clothes hugged her body tightly. She wore tastefully done makeup, and I could have sworn that her voice became softer. It was obvious to anyone who had eyes that Lucy was trying to get the boss's attention. Now, I have a huge crush on Lucy. I was damn near obsessed with her, and why not? Any man would be crazy about her. She was insanely attractive. I would follow her around the house like a puppy, hoping that one day she would give up on her unrealistic dream of marrying the boss and notice me. It wasn't that she was not beautiful enough for the boss to be attracted to her. She was young, good-looking, had a gorgeous smile, and was easily accessible given that we all lived together, but the boss was a wealthy entrepreneur. He knew many actresses, models, and daughters of prominent men and women who were just as beautiful and even more beautiful than Lucy. They are also more sophisticated and, let's face it, intelligent. Lucy may be drop-down gorgeous, but sometimes she displays a scary level of naivete that even me, who is rarely ever shocked. There was just no way that the boss would marry her. I thought at first that he might be attracted enough to her to want to have a fling or something similar, but marriage? Hell would have to freeze over for that to happen. Interestingly, the boss didn't even have that sort of surface level attraction for her. He just never even looked at her in that way, and it drove her nuts. One time, one of the boss's associates showed some interest in her. He took her out on a couple dates and then dumped her abruptly. What he did does not even qualify as dumping. He just stopped speaking to her, wouldn't take her calls, and whenever he saw her in the house, he looked away. We found out months later that he ghosted her because he was getting married. Apparently, all those times that he took her out and did God knows what else, he was engaged to be married. Lucy was heartbroken. She cried her eyes out. The children's nanny and I were there for her. We comforted her and tried all we could to make her feel better and cover up for her at work. She felt very disappointed because the man had made grand promises to her and she believed him. Anyway, after she got over the whole thing, she promised to leave rich men alone. She even told the nanny, "Maybe I'm destined to marry for love." A few months after she was ghosted, we got closer and started dating. It was so surreal. I was determined to give her a semblance of the life she wanted. I wanted to be better, to earn better for her. I already imagined how beautiful our lives would be together. I genuinely believed that she was done dreaming about marrying a millionaire or a billionaire, and that she was in love with me and I was in love with her. She introduced me to all her friends, she wrote me love letters even though we lived in the same house, and she met my sister and my best friend. Even the nanny was happy for us. Everything was perfect, and I looked forward to getting married to her until the same guy who ghosted her came back. He came to the house one day to visit our boss, and that was it. I don't know what he said to my Lucy or what happened, but she told me that she needed space. I was shocked and disappointed. At the time, I didn't even know for a fact that something had happened between them, but I suspected that her reason for wanting distance had to do with his visit. I thought of different things, and it drove me crazy. What if he said something to her? Maybe she saw him and got hurt all over again and needed some time to process it. I tried to talk her into changing her mind, but she refused. I saw that she wasn't going to change her mind, so I let her be. I was hurt though. I remember asking for a week off and going to stay with my sister because I just couldn't handle working and seeing her every day after that. After that week off, I almost completely got over it. Lucy had always been confused about what she really wanted anyway, so I wasn't going to let her rejection ruin the quality of my work and risk me getting fired from a job I truly enjoyed. When I resumed, the nanny called me aside and told me that Lucy was back to dating the man who ghosted her. His marriage ended shortly after the wedding. He came back to see our boss, ran into Lucy, and managed to convince her to get back together with him. And my girlfriend agreed to ditch me for a guy who ghosted her. When the nanny told me, I felt stupid, but not for long. I just said to myself that the actual stupid one was Lucy. She was stupid enough to believe that someone who cheated on his fiancé with her, ghosted her, and then wanted her back after his wife of less than a year left him was going to make an honest woman out of her. I managed to convince the nanny that I was fine with the whole thing. I also pretended to be okay with it when I actually spoke to Lucy too. At first, she tried to avoid me because she was probably feeling guilty, but then I assured her that it was okay and that I was cool with us going back to being friends. She believed me, and that didn't surprise me because, like I said, she was not very bright. Not surprisingly, the guy she left me for ghosted her again shortly after. This time, she went to his house to try and get him to talk to her, but he embarrassed her and threatened to call our boss and tell him she was harassing him. She ran back home in tears. The nanny mocked her and blamed her for leaving me for him, but I pretended to be chill about the whole thing. I tried comforting her and told her not to bother too much about him. I encouraged her to double down on her efforts to get our boss to look at her. Better for him than some unstable guy who blows hot and cold all the time. She agreed that that was a good idea and went back to putting great effort into how she looked in the house. Months later, I lied to her that the boss told me he had feelings for her. Of all the staff, the nanny was the closest to the boss, seeing as she took care of his kids. But after the nanny, I was the closest. I served him his meals and drinks, and sometimes we watched the game together. She was the least close to the boss since all she did was clean. She believed me because I was close to the boss as well. After all, she's not very bright, as I mentioned earlier. She was excited about it. I told her that the boss was worried about telling her and that he was scared she'd turn him down. She was surprised that our boss, who was ordinarily very bold, was too shy to confess his feelings for her, but she believed me anyway. For weeks, I would tell her things our boss asked me to tell her, and she would tell me things she wanted me to pass on to him too. It was fun for me to build her expectations and make her think that her dream man was secretly in love with her. At some point, I even started to write letters and then lie to her that the letters were from our boss. She would read them with dreamy eyes and express her hope that one day they'd be together for real. I told her that he didn't want to come to her himself because he was worried that that would be too unprofessional, and he wanted to speak to her for the first time when he was sure. After I fed her with enough lies, I decided it was time to carry out the master plan, the actual revenge. I told her that our boss was planning an event for the two of them. He wanted to officially confess his feelings for her in the presence of his friends, associates, and some of his family members. In truth, the boss wanted to make an important announcement to his close associates, friends, and family about a business he was launching. Lucy was excited. She even called her mother, whom I'm sure was as invested in gold digging as she is. I told her he wanted her to dress in a beautiful red dress, wear a nice makeup, and come in at a certain time when his friends were around. Before that day, Lucy took out a huge sum of her savings and went shopping for a very nice, expensive dress. She had her makeup and her hair professionally done and got ready for later that evening. She was so excited about being revealed as the new Mrs. that she couldn't even eat. The boss's guests came in later that evening, and they all went into his private conference room. I stood outside, waiting to tell Lucy when it was time to go in and have him introduce her. After a while, I told her that it was time to go in. She waltzed down the stairs in her heavy makeup, opened the door to the conference room, and went in. Now, I don't know what happened in the room because I wasn't inside, but our boss said he was confused about who she was at first. Another interesting and ironic thing about the situation was that our boss was secretly dating an associate, and she was in the room that evening. Anyway, she ended up feeling very embarrassed that evening. She tried to bring up how the boss had been sending her love letters, but the boss was irritated. He insisted that she was sent by his enemies to ruin his big announcement and his relationship, and he fired her on the spot. He eventually rehired her after finding out what had actually happened. He didn't blame me for getting back at her after what she did, by the way. After he rehired her, she was too embarrassed to keep working in that house, so she quit and moved out. Our next story is, my lazy team member took credit for my work, so I let him fail. I, 22-year-old female, had always taken pride in my work, believing that effort would be rewarded and that a job well done spoke for itself. I was fresh out of school, still learning the ropes in a competitive company. When I joined this job, I had ambitions, ideas, and a drive to climb the ladder on merit. I was the type who stayed late, put in extra effort, and ensured every task I handled was top-notch. It all began with the announcement of a major company project, one that had every department buzzing. This wasn't just any project. Management had plans to use it to scout top talent among the entry-level workers. There was talk of hefty bonuses, recognition, and even a promotion for the standout performers. We were told that the project would take several weeks. The stakes were high, and everyone wanted a piece of it. I was ready to give it my all. I had been looking for an opportunity to prove myself, and this seemed like the perfect moment. But then came the roster announcement. My excitement took a hit the moment I saw who I'd be working with. Brian, 28-year-old male, our office's infamous slacker, alongside a couple of others from our team. Brian had a reputation for being charming but lazy, a lethal combo in a group project. He was known for smiling his way through assignments, putting in the bare minimum, and somehow he'd managed to coast along without management ever noticing. I'd heard stories about him dodging responsibility, occasionally feigning illnesses or family emergencies to avoid deadlines, and then somehow always showing up when all the work is done and calling it a team effort. I tried to stay positive, hoping that all the stakes of this project would motivate Brian to step up. After all, we were all working towards a common goal, and there was plenty of recognition to go around if we pulled off something impressive. But I soon realized that even this wasn't enough to make him committed. At the first project meeting, I laid out a plan, assigning roles, setting a timeline, and emphasizing the importance of collaboration. But even as I spoke, I could see Brian checking his phone, only half listening, occasionally nodding along without contributing a single idea of his own. When it came time for him to commit to specific tasks, he gave vague answers and avoided direct responsibilities, saying things like, "Oh, I can help out wherever I'm needed." Over the next week, his lack of involvement became painfully obvious. Every time I sent out updates or scheduled meetings, Brian was either absent or non-committal. If he responded at all, his messages were short and superficial, like, "Looks good to me," or "I'm on it," with no evidence that he actually was. When I reached out to ask if he could handle a basic task, he dodged the request, saying that he was tied up with other projects or department priorities. As the deadline drew closer, I started taking on more and more of the workload. Other team members pitched in here and there, but it was clear that if I wanted the project to succeed, I'd have to do most of it myself. My days were packed with researching, analyzing data, compiling reports, and piecing together a presentation that would be both engaging and thorough. I was exhausted, but I kept telling myself it would be worth it in the end. This project could open doors for me, and I wasn't about to let it fall apart because of one lazy teammate. As the hours piled up, so did my frustration. Each time I'd look over at Brian during office hours, he'd be casually chatting by the coffee machine or scrolling on his phone, showing no urgency or commitment to the project. It felt like I was running a marathon while he strolled leisurely, fully expecting to cross the finish line without breaking a sweat. I began to feel a gnawing sense of dread. I'd heard stories about Brian swooping in at the last minute to claim credit for team efforts. He had a way of framing things so that he seemed more involved than he was, dropping just enough buzzwords and throwing in vague mentions of my contributions to mislead anyone who hadn't been directly involved in the project. My concerns were validated a week before the presentation when Brian casually mentioned that he'd like to take the lead on delivering the project to upper management. His reason? He claimed to be more comfortable with public speaking, hinting that he'd practiced presentations extensively. I knew this was his strategy. He'd coast along, contribute little, then jump in to present the work as if it were his. But by then, it was too late to argue. After all, how could I prove that I'd done all the heavy lifting? The rest of the team seemed indifferent, either unwilling to challenge him or feeling that it wasn't worth the trouble. To them, it was just another project, a chance to add something to their resumes, but to me, it was a proving ground. I couldn't shake the feeling that Brian would end up getting the lion's share of credit for my work, but I was stuck. I didn't want to create friction within the team or appear overly competitive, so I reluctantly agreed to let him take the reins on presentation day, with a plan brewing in the back of my mind. For now, though, I kept my head down and kept working, pushing myself harder than ever to make sure the project was flawless. I couldn't control Brian's actions, but I could control the quality of my work. I figured if the project was exceptional, management would see through any empty showboating. Little did Brian know, his little stunt was about to backfire. The very tactics he'd used to ride on others' efforts were going to come full circle, and this time, he wouldn't be able to talk his way out of it. The moment Brian made it clear he'd be taking the lead on the presentation, something in me snapped. I'd already put in countless hours, taking on the brunt of the workload, pushing myself to ensure every detail was perfect. I couldn't stand the thought of him swooping in at the last moment, presenting my work and taking credit for everything. That's when I decided, if he wanted to present the project, he would, just not in the way he expected. I started by gathering a paper trail, meticulously documenting every contribution I'd made, every email exchange, every draft, every meeting note that reflected my efforts was carefully organized and stored. I'd backed up files, noted every detail, and even printed out some documents, knowing that physical evidence would carry more weight if I ever needed it. I made sure there was no ambiguity about who had done the work and who had avoided it. But my plan was about more than just gathering proof. I wanted Brian to trip up in a way that would leave no room for interpretation. Knowing his habit of coasting along and relying on others to fill in the blanks, I decided to make subtle adjustments to the final report and presentation. These wouldn't be noticeable to anyone who had truly worked on the project, but to someone like Brian, who hadn't even skimmed the surface, they would be a trap waiting to spring. I began with some strategic changes to our data tables and graphs. For example, I swapped certain numbers between categories and mislabeled a few key metrics, shifting figures just enough that someone unfamiliar with the material would misinterpret the results. Next, I adjusted a few of our key insights and recommendations, using complex jargon and referencing hypothetical trends that didn't really exist. For anyone invested in the project, these minor errors would stick out, but for someone like Brian, who was banking on presenting without preparation, they'd slide by unnoticed. To ensure these adjustments went undetected, I made sure to position myself as a source of support in the days leading up to the presentation. Brian, unaware of the changes I'd made, was more than happy to let me polish the final product. I even encouraged him to go through the data in his own way, reassuring him that I'd handle any last-minute issues. I didn't want to spook him by appearing too involved. I wanted him to feel comfortable, in control, and fully confident that he'd managed to slip past without any work. Then I went a step further. I offered to prepare a cheat sheet for him with key talking points. Under the guise of helping him stay organized, I created an outline of misleading information. Fake stats, exaggerated projections, and vague insights that were convincing enough to sound important, but were entirely false. I knew he'd trust this document over the actual report, relying on it as his last-minute crutch. All he had to do was follow my outline, and that's exactly what I hoped he would do. Meanwhile, I made sure to subtly clue in my manager about the work I'd put into the project. Without outright complaining, I mentioned how excited I was about the details, how hard I'd worked on the analysis, and dropped hints that I'd handled the majority of the project. I positioned it as enthusiasm, as though I were simply proud to have had such an integral role. I didn't want to come across as resentful, just dedicated. By the time the presentation day arrived, I had secured my manager's attention, planted the seeds of doubt about Brian's involvement, and prepared a mountain of evidence for when the inevitable fallout would happen. With everything in place, I waited. I watched as Brian, blissfully unaware of the trap he was walking into, strutted confidently into the conference room on the day of the presentation, carrying the doctored materials I'd prepared. This wasn't just about proving my hard work anymore. It was about watching him finally face the consequences of his arrogance and laziness. Brian stepped up to the podium, his usual swagger on full display. He cleared his throat, glanced at the cheat sheet I'd given him, and launched into his speech with the same charm he'd always used to skate by. His confidence radiated through the room as he began to outline the project, all while I sat in my seat, watching everything unfold, calm on the outside but secretly anticipating the unraveling that was about to happen. The first few slides were basic introductions and background information, areas I hadn't altered. Brian was in his comfort zone, talking and gliding through with the ease of someone who hadn't bothered with details. I watched as he gestured toward the projected slides, glancing occasionally at his notes without missing a beat. He was so self-assured, as if the hard work behind every point came from him, but that confidence started to falter as he moved further along. When he reached the section with the modified data tables, I leaned forward slightly, trying to keep my expression neutral. He glanced down at the notes, following the cheat sheet as planned, and began reciting the fake metrics I'd laid out. I could see a shift in his expression, a small crease forming in his brow as he tried to make sense of the numbers that weren't quite adding up. He stumbled slightly but pushed on, throwing in a few buzzwords in an attempt to mask his uncertainty. For anyone listening closely, though, it was clear that he was grasping at straws. Then came the fabricated projections. According to the doctored figures, our project was set to outperform even the most optimistic estimates. Brian began reading these projections aloud, but the figures were so exaggerated that I saw my manager raise his brow. My coworkers exchanged confused glances. It was obvious that these numbers didn't align with the company's actual market trends, but Brian kept going, as if the illusion could hold if he just delivered the information confidently enough. As we went deeper into the analysis, the hypothetical trends section I'd fabricated next, Brian visibly began to sweat. The data made no sense, and it was clear he was struggling to connect the dots. He stumbled over the terms, hesitating on each point as though he were reading a foreign language. He cast a quick glance around the room, perhaps hoping to catch a reassuring nod or some sign of understanding, but he was met with confusion and skepticism instead. In a final attempt to stay composed, he tried to skip ahead to the conclusions, hoping to gloss over the details and wrap things up on a high note. But that was when he hit the trap I'd set. The conclusions, completely tailored to fall apart under scrutiny, didn't reflect our project's actual findings at all. They were filled with vague promises and inflated claims, completely disconnected from reality. By now, the room had shifted from silent confusion to palpable doubt. My manager, who had stayed quiet until then, finally spoke up, asking Brian to clarify a few points on the data. Brian, caught off guard, fumbled for answers, his charm dissolving as he stammered through a half-baked explanation. Each question dug him deeper into a hole as he struggled to explain concepts he hadn't actually worked on. I could feel everyone realize that Brian hadn't done the work, and he didn't understand the project at all. I let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of his blunders to sink in, but I knew it was time to step in. Clearing my throat, I offered to help clarify some points, gently correcting the figures, providing accurate projections. The relief on my manager's face was immediate. I methodically went through each slide, setting the record straight and ensuring the audience understood the true scope and value of our work. By the end, Brian's face was pale, his bravado shattered. He sat slumped in his chair, his earlier confidence utterly gone. When I finished, the applause was polite but directed towards me, a stark contrast to the silence that had followed his presentation. My manager offered a few final comments, praising the team's efforts but with a pointed nod in my direction, making it clear who had truly carried the project. The fallout was swift. Brian's behavior couldn't be ignored any longer, and with the evidence I'd accumulated, he couldn't talk his way out of this one. By the end of the week, he was called into HR, where he received a notice of disciplinary action, and within days, his position was re-evaluated. The higher-ups had seen enough to know he hadn't contributed to the project, and after a short investigation, his charm was no longer enough to keep him employed. As for me, I received more than just credit for the project. My manager personally thanked me for my dedication, and I was given a bonus and an opportunity to lead future initiatives. It was everything I'd hoped for, and more. Brian's manipulations had finally caught up with him, and his attempt to steal credit for my hard work ended up costing him his job. With that being said, that's all the time we have for today. If you enjoyed today's video, drop a like and comment below, and if you want to check out our other videos, click the video on the right. With that being said, I'll see you all next time.